Thanks for coming out, everybody. I know it's slippery out there, and hopefully it won't get too bad before we get out of here, but we really did want to take this opportunity to honor our winners of our first ethics essay contest we held last year, and we're really pleased that they're going to discuss the ideas in their papers today. Before I say a little bit more about that, just some housekeeping stuff. When you came in, those of you who are students, if you're here for extra credit or signature credit, please make sure to swipe in outside. If you want to get our blast, so you know what's coming up next, on the Ethics Center schedule, we have an email sign-up list outside as well, plus other goodies. So feel free to just, graze outside and take whatever looks interesting. Also, graze at the buffet table. We do have some refreshments, and if you don't eat them, they throw them out. So please do indulge in a quick or two coffees and pop. Again, this is a celebration. We want everybody to feel really welcome. I also wanted to call your attention to the next event on the Ethics Center schedule that's coming up later this month on the 29th. We have the Dean of the College of Health and Human Services talking about a really timely topic, the opioid epidemic that's been making headlines. The title of his talk is, Does Community-Wide Public Health Prevention Work? From Reducing Teen Births to Addressing Today's Opioid Epidemic. That talk is at 6 o'clock on January 29 here in the Bernhardt Center, but this time on the first floor, rooms 157, 158. Again, we have a series of events throughout the rest of the semester. Feel free to take a flyer and stay up to date. And now, turning to our ethics contest. The theme of the contest actually is a vision statement of the Ethics Center. We just got through revising our mission statement and coming up with a new vision statement, values statement, all that good stuff. And in fact, we have some cool bookmarks on the table outside with our new vision statement and our values, if you'd like to take those. And we ask students to really reflect on that theme as they relate it to their own experiences with ethics in all walks of life. And so we're pleased to have the two winners of our contest here today. Mitchell, is it Winget? Winget. I should have asked you how to pronounce that last name. I meant to do that. His winning paper is titled A Realistic Approach to Moral Responsibility. He's a graduate student in the philosophy department. Do we have anybody here from Mitchell today? Okay, good. And the undergraduate winner is Arthur Woodworth, and he's aeroscience engineering. Did I get that right? Aerospace engineering. Not quite right. And the title of his paper is Making Ethics Vital. The vision statement, by the way, that they were reflecting on is dedicated to making ethics vital in our communities. Paul Farber, who's a professor in the Department of
Teaching, Learning, and Educational Studies.
Thank you. And who also sits on the advisory board at the Ethics Center, is here to just help get the discussion going. And I forgot to ask if anybody's here for Arthur. Yay, great, thank you. So nice to have you guys come out and support your students. Without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Paul. It's in good hands, I know, so thank you.
Well, welcome. It's a great pleasure to be here. It was also a great pleasure to read these papers, and I think it's something that I encourage you to do. In this session, we don't have time to read the papers in full, and so I've asked Arthur and Mitchell to give us a sense of what motivated them in the writing of the paper, the central themes of their papers, and what they see as most important that comes from the thinking that they did. It was a real pleasure to meet, certainly a pleasure to meet them, congratulate them on their work, and it's a wonderful start for what I hope is an annual event. Can you guarantee that?
I can't guarantee anything, but it's highly likely.
Well, these papers certainly indicate that it's a worthy endeavor, and so it's a pleasure to get the ball rolling. I think what we'll do is take something like 10 minutes and hear from both Arthur and then Mitchell, I think in that order, and then after that we'll have a chance to just talk about things related to these papers. There's a lot to think about in these papers, and I'm sure you'll be happy to take part in and interested in the conversation that follows. So, Arthur, if you would lead off, that would be great.
All right. The title of my paper was Making Ethics Vital. What motivated me to write the paper was that I had been doing some reading in my spare time of various philosophers and also B.F. Skinner. And I was noticing last semester I read B.F. Skinner's book, Beyond Freedom and Dignity. I was noticing in that book a lot of the arguments he was making were fairly parallel to arguments made by Michael Bakunin and Peter Kropotkin, which are major anarchist philosophers. So I was interested in the sort of weird relation between these two. And then I saw a poster across campus about ethics essay contest, and I saw what the theme was, and I was like, oh, this works perfectly. So I figured I would write an essay. So the beginning part of the essay, I discussed where the idea of ethics comes from, according to Skinner and Kropotkin mostly. And so when we're talking about ethics, really what comes out of that is ethical behavior. So the manifestation of it. And they argue, Skinner and Kropotkin, that ethical behaviors come from simply behaviors that are necessary for group survival. So I take that and I say that this should be, what we focus ethics on. And I also discuss how the way capitalism has developed has tied survival, especially individuals, but also humanity as a whole, to personal wealth. And one of the things I cite in the paper is a study released last year that showed that in 2017, the richest people on Earth acquired enough wealth in that year alone to end extreme poverty 7 times over. So what this indicates is that the ability to survive is being essentially hoarded by a very small amount of people. Because if you look at the numbers, it's about 2,500 out of every person on Earth. Clearly, that's not conducive to human survival. So I present that if we want to make ethics vital in our communities, we have to make the material conditions of life stable enough that we can actually, sit around and discuss ethics, let alone put them into practice. And to that point, I suggest a sort of a slight modification of Skinner's ideas, that if we are going to have ethics that are vital in our communities, we need to have an agreement of what ethics should be, which, as I said earlier, should be to promote the survival of the general humanity. But also we need to be able to scientifically determine what's going to be the best set of behaviors to promote human survival. That's where Skinner's ideas come in, because behaviors. But he generally promoted people who knew about behavior would be the one in charge of behavior, whereas I suggest that that's not going to be helpful, and rather the whole of society should be engaged in the scientific process of determining the best behaviors. I also fit along with some of the things he said in Beyond Freedom and Dignity. Yeah, but the main problems that all that presents is that one, we need to be able to stabilize life, which means we need to get rid of all the mass inequality generated by capitalism, and we need to stop climate change, which we only have 12 years to limit the most severe impacts. If you read the reports about that, it's not eliminating all the impacts, it's just making them somewhat less bad. And then if we can manage to do both those things, then we also need to develop a culture that is both cooperative and scientific, so that we can work together as a large, massive society to figure out how to best promote our whole survival. So that's pretty much.
Thanks. I know you recognize there are a lot of things to talk about there, and again, the melding of things that Arthur has brought into this paper. It's really fascinating. I want to hold your thought, hold your questions, and we'll hear from Mitchell next. His paper, Realistic Approach to Moral Responsibility. And then talk about both of the papers separately if you like. If you have questions for either Arthur or Mitchell. We can also talk about some of the interesting kinds of connections between them. So, Mitchell?
Thanks. Okay, so in my paper, I sort of, before submitting to it, I had been looking at a puzzle that's kind of popular in moral philosophy. And in trying to solve that puzzle, I came to conclusions that had implications with this prompt for this competition was. So, but anyway, the puzzle in moral philosophy is called the puzzle of moral deference. And the idea behind that is, typically when we do applied ethics or things like that, we get the impression that what we're doing, at least half the supposition of what we're doing is meaningful, and that what we're doing can be rationally communicated. However, there seems to be a puzzle with moral deference, because some have argued that if what we do in morality or in ethics is grounded in what they would call a realistic approach, so that means that we actually have beliefs that tend to track objective truths, so moral truths. Well, the problem there is, if that's what we're doing in ethics, why is it that there seems to be an asymmetry between something like non-moral deference and moral deference? So as an example, you might say, the capital of Syria is Damascus. My geography professor told me so. That doesn't seem problematic. But if you said something like, abortion is X, my ethics professor told me so, that seems to be a little bit problematic. And so philosophers have said, it seems like maybe this is implying that there isn't realism in ethics, and that maybe why we're bothered by this kind of asymmetry is because really ethics is just an expression of one's emotional disposition or allegiances in some way. And then, of course, it would make a lot of sense why you would defer to someone, because why would you defer to anyone when all you're going to get is their emotions on the subject? So, anyway, in trying to solve this puzzle, there is an attempt on the realist camp to explain why we might rationally have these intuitions while still allowing for something like realism to be true in ethics. And so I looked at two of these authors who took one takes an approach called epistemic pessimism, and that just means there's something about knowledge and morality that isn't attainable, where it is in non-moral issues. And so that explains our asymmetry there. And then there's the other side that takes what's called moral pessimism. And they say, no, there's actually something morally unworthy about someone who defers in ethical matters. And so anyway, I look at both approaches. The first approach was by Sarah McGrath and and she uses an argument from epistemology called the neutrality principle. And this comes from Henry Sidgwick, and the idea there is that if you have two intellectual peers and they have a disagreement about something, knowledge on that issue, say issue Y, should be neutralized at the moment, because your intellectual peers, and as long as no one in the situation is biased or is intoxicated or something like that, then the knowledge of this, any knowledge of Y must be neutralized, rationally speaking. And then she argues in ethics it's even worse than that, because usually we can sort of look to the experts on something. So if we happen to be intellectual peers and you tend to think flat earth theory is true and I happen to think the earth is round, we always have this ability to appeal to an expert. And the experts have a consensus of some kind. And so we don't have to worry about the neutrality principle there. But she argues that in ethics it's a little different, because we don't have an independent way of measuring our ethical judgments. So with a meteorologist, they can say something like, oh, it's going to rain tomorrow, and there's this independent source of empirical data to justify their reasoning. But in the case of ethics, the only thing we justify our reasoning with is moral reasoning. And so she thinks there needs to be an independent source there. I argue against that. But ultimately, she says that what's guiding our intuitions here is that we're epistemically pessimistic. We don't think knowledge can be attained there, except in really uncontroversial situations, like killing your grandmother or something. And then we move to moral unworthiness, which is Alison Hill's thesis. And she says that no, we can actually have moral knowledge. You can say Y is wrong and reasons X is Y, and I can have a true justified belief there. But the problem is, I don't really have a moral worthiness about what I'm doing if I don't have, and then she delineates all these things that she calls moral understanding. So if you give me a reason as to why it's wrong to do something, but I can't take that reason and explain it in my own words, and she has other requirements too, like explain it in my own words, find situations that are comparable and derive the same conclusion in a comparable way, and all these kinds of things. So I argue against that as well, but that might be tempting. Consider both the epistemic pessimism and the moral pessimism. But ultimately, what I end up concluding is that there might be some ambiguity with the way we think about deference. It's important to think about a distinction in the action of deference itself. Because some people tend to think, well, if you say no to deference, you're basically saying no to seeking moral advice when you're morally unsure, and that seems a little bit precarious. But I don't think it ends or begins at moral advice. If you seek out testimony, deference is going to be a matter of how you receive the testimony. So I divided into a distinction between what we can call moral inquiry, or excuse me, there's two steps to deference. And there is moral inquiry, where it seems pretty virtuous for someone who's unsure to appeal to who they deem to be an expert on something. But then in the second step, we have what I would call passive integration. And that would be a situation where once you've been given the judgment, you just passively adopt the judgment, sort of mindlessly, and you just carry out the dictates of the judgment. Or perhaps in the worst case scenario, you might actually think, wow, that doesn't seem right, but you acquiesce anyway. And that's where deference begins. So I argue that we could rationally explain the intuition on a realistic account by saying that we find the virtue in this matter to be moral reflection. And by moral reflection, I say that you're taking a judgment and you're adopting that judgment on a conjunctive account of, one, that the judgment is from someone you deem to be a moral authority, and it's not inconsistent with other virtues and standards of intellect that you might have. And so that way we get a situation where you're not advocating your responsibility, and we find that to be more virtuous. And I think ultimately it connects back because what we see is that moral reflection is exactly the kind of vital component to what we do in ethics, or in civic discourse or in any kind of deliberative process. So rather than simply blindly adhering to perhaps institutional protocols or even maybe religious mandates or government laws, when we happen to just trust the party for the sake of the party, we still owe it to ourselves to reflect, and that's really what's vital to our own moral development.
Thank you, Mitchell, and I'm sure you'll agree. Both of these papers, they're very different, and both have some really interesting, rich ideas. Just to kick off a conversation, I thought I would pose a question for both of you to think about in relation to the theme. This theme is the vision of the Ethics Center, which is to serve the purpose of encouraging vital ethics in our communities, vitality of ethics, that it matters, that ethics matters. And I think it's really striking the different points of view from which these two papers address what it means for ethics to matter. So, Arthur, you were talking about, well, ethics matters if we organize our thinking about ethics, about what is most vital, which is this question of survival, and you put it in the context of climate change and the excessive concentration of wealth and where that is tending, and very large-scale issues. And you get a sense that whatever we can do to collaboratively, collectively use not just our wits, but what we know about scientific inquiry to work toward engineering ways of behaving that help us get on top of that, then we should do it. We collectively should do it. And so ethics is vital because it would be part of that, and to the extent it is part of that kind of a singular mission. And turning to Matthew's paper, it really flips things almost completely on its head, because in a sense, where this paper ends up with regard to this very interesting and fascinating issue about when and in what ways we defer, and how does our deference to authority or expert testimony, how does that fit in with the goal of moral responsibility? And it's very problematic, as Matthew suggests, and the approach to that is taken in the end centers on this educational, sort of fundamental process of moral agency, a person wrestling with the difficult questions in life and coming to some kind of engaging a process of reflective deliberations that help them move toward judgments that are their own. And so it's building from the kind of the grassroots. Ethics is vital to the extent that we're in communities that encourage that kind of wrestling on a person-by-person basis with the really hard questions. And I was wondering how those fit, and how you would see them fitting, or if they even coexist as approaches to ethics. And let me just toss it out, and whatever comments you might have about the relationship with C, or the complementary, or whatever, you can take it from there, and then I hope I'm sure there are questions we'll turn to afterwards, but let's start there.
So I do, actually, as I was listening to this, there is some overlap, I think, more than it might look at first. I'm sympathetic, actually, to some of the, I'm not too familiar with Skinner, but I am familiar a bit with Bakunin and Hawking and some of the anarchist viewpoints, and also the way that they overlapped with what's called in sociology a functionalist approach. Durkheim writes about that and stuff too. And since I did commit myself in my paper to a realist approach, so that means that I'm saying that morality does have some symmetry was the non-moral world of truth and objectivity. But I'm kind of accountable for explaining that. And I do give a kind of normative account of why we seem to think that the virtue of reflection is something we ought to commit ourselves to. Though some might be thinking, well, how is that a realist approach? Because it's not so clear that reflection is an objective good. But I think that, and it's a more complicated project in the long run that I'm trying to work on, but I think to some extent science does have a place in what we're doing with ethics in understanding behaviors that are conducive to flourishing. But I don't think that it's in the way that some popular figures have been arguing as of recently, that flourishing is just defined by basically some kind of utilitarian calculus, or what's going to make everyone more, what's going to induce the most pleasure in the long run or something. I think it's more complicated than that. And I think it comes down to having a proper understanding of the kinds of social practices that uniquely refer back to the very virtues that they were sort of born out of. And I think as a society, if we try to think of our lives in a more purposive manner, we begin to see that there are, so for example, take this conference, okay? Most of us here have a sense, a kind of consensus underlying our actions right now, which is that a conference has a certain purpose, which is to sort of share in this kind of conversation and maybe learn something from it and have a nice orderly exchange of ideas. Well, you can derive certain virtues once you have that purpose in mind, because now the end begins to justify all these means, like we should be patient, we should be attentive to the person speaking, and all of these things are just sort of conducive to the flourishing of this conference. And so there's an objectivity there. Most people in here would think, yeah, it's totally the right thing to do, to be patient and attentive, to take turns in talking, rather than to get up and start doing cartwheels or something. So once we start thinking in a purposive mindset about the various social practices that really make up our lives, I think we can start realizing that there's more objectivity than we think. There's more rational means of prescribing certain sorts of action. But the question is, does a society like our own, which really puts a lot of value on self-interest and a lot of value on individualist sorts of thinking, whether that's slowly tearing away at our common consensus that we have throughout history about certain social practices. And if we lose that common thread, we might find ourselves thinking that morality is more and more subjective, because really if it's about maximizing my self-interest or even the aggregate, it's very difficult to derive consistent morals, for example. So science might help us in learning how we retain these virtues and what a social practice is properly conceived of as, but I don't think that we can get it on science alone.
Can I just take off from that and just, Arthur, to ask you, because one of the things I sense in your paper is a kind of, and maybe it's your engineering background, but there is a sense we have to get on with this. We have to get focused, and what Matthew's describing is a beautiful description of kind of the varieties of practices in which we engage in things, and you know, but they tend to go on in many directions, and I feel a kind of urgency comes through in your paper that, you know, that in a way that's a distraction, you know, and I'm not sure if I'm misreading that. And I was wondering if maybe just to ask one question about your sense. I was wondering if your paper reflected more of a is it a pessimism about the course we're on, that we have to do something? We're in an urgent situation. Or was it more of an optimism that we're not using our best kind of tools for kind of building our social behaviors in the right direction? And I was wondering which, I was curious to see, where you were in terms of those two possible kind of mindsets about the things you were writing.
Well, I mean, there is a certain amount of pessimism to be certain. In that if we don't start doing something, we won't be able to do it later. But I think there's mostly optimism in that if we decide to start doing something, then we'll be able to do pretty good things.
Let me just open it up to comments or questions you've been holding off for a long time. So, are there comments or questions?
Oh, is it one of the
Yeah,
minutes?
there's
I'm
one.
sorry, go ahead, please.
I just want to say that I'm not really familiar with the works of Skinner and Atkin that you're referencing, and I wonder if you can talk just a little bit more about those.
Yeah, okay, so the main thing that I reference with Kropotkin is, so he was a geologist, like as a job, but as a philosopher, he was an anarchist. And a lot of what he did was he analyzed how the political idea of anarchism fits with like biological actualities. But so in the book that I referenced that we didn't finish before he died, he says that the main problem of modern realistic ethics is to determine first of all the moral end in view, which is a large part of what with my paper. But he also says we must find moral satisfaction in life and not in some form of extra vital condition. This goes with the idea that I put forward of, we need to focus on survival as the goal of ethics. He uses an example of this, of where ethics derive from, by, if you look at a large colony of birds, and if you see a young bird trying to steal some straw from another bird's nest, all the other birds are going to attack it. And this would seem to be, enforcing an ethical principle that you shouldn't steal. But in actuality, it's a group survival behavior, because if there's no reinforcement against stealing other materials, this starts getting into Skinner territory of behaviorism, the study of behavior. But if there's not a reinforcement against stealing materials for your nest from other birds' nests, then eventually, since it's the easiest thing to do, because otherwise you have to go off somewhere and find your own nest materials. Everyone will be fighting over little scraps of nest, and there won't be any more birds. So that's Kropotkin's analysis of where ethics come from, mixed with some of Skinner's descriptions. One of the quotes I have from Skinner in the paper is that almost everyone makes ethical and moral judgments, but this does not mean that the human species has an inborn need or demand for ethical standards. Whereas he says that you could say just as well it has an inborn need or demand for unethical behavior. You know something's wrong, but you might do it anyway. And that happens rather a lot. So yeah, Skinner was mostly concerned with understanding how behavior works and how to adjust behavior. And so
So, I'm originally going to ask about something else, but now it makes me wonder. Again, contrasting the two papers, you know, you're focusing on survival, you're focusing on flourishing. So I'd say survival is probably necessary but not sufficient for flourishing, right? I mean, you know, so you want the basics taken care of, but you said, you know, there seems to be more to it than just, you know, adding up individual, right, goods or something like that. So, so I guess I'm interested in kind of this threshold. So maybe it kind of goes back to your question too, Paul. So I mean, of necessity, do we have to focus on survival because we're just in such dire circumstances, and where does that leave the project of flourishing? Or, you know, to some degree, are we perhaps flourishing at the expense of survival? Is that possible? Are we engaging in some social practices that necessitate actually, in a way, kind of shortening our lifespan or something like that, or the lifespan of the planet? Flourishing in the short term, but perhaps not surviving in the long term?
well, I would say that the definition of survival that I use in my paper is pretty much flourishing.
Oh, same thing, okay.
Yeah, kind of.
Right.
So, I spent a lot of time discussing how, you know, if you don't have the ability to, like, you don't have the means to survive, you just
Well, you
forced
can't do
into
anything,
action. Right. So you're not making any sort of decisions, you're just doing what you have to. Whereas if you're, you know, in a stable situation of survival,
Then you have the luxury, let's say,
Right.
of focusing on some of these other goods or something like that.
Yeah. So yeah, it's kind of hard. Flourishing is kind of a vague term, and you know, virtue ethics, it tends to be the end goal of human development. That's the way Aristotle had put it across. But of course, since then, people have debated quite a bit about it, because it's like, well, what are we saying? That there's a biological goal here, that we have to, that we have some kind of natural process, like an oak tree, you know, has to reach a certain sort of from the seed to the tree. It has this, you know, there's this whole notion of its teleology and what purpose it aims towards. And science has, in a large part, sort of debunked the idea that things are much more random than we think, and that there's nothing really about an oak tree or something that has oak treeness built into it. It does, but it doesn't in any kind of permanent, sort of divine way or anything. But I think that it's possible to accept that picture of science, at least the premise, if you want, and still derive a notion of teleology in our social practices. And that's kind of the idea that I was putting across with something like a conference. Human beings are arguably very groupish, like very much a social animal. So it wouldn't be surprising to me if it is a tendency within us that needs to be satisfied in order for us to maintain group organization. So I think flourishing doesn't need to be understood in a really kind of analytic way, like flourishing means survival. But I would take probably the other way around. Survival is certainly an aspect of flourishing. I mean, if we were all starving in here at Ebola, like this conference isn't going to work out too well. And so that probably puts things like poverty and things like clear and obvious suffering should take a lot of precedence in any question of what virtue is given us in social practice. And it's interesting to me that what virtue we probably think of most often when it comes to something like someone dying of starvation compassion. And yet it doesn't seem that our political discourse has a whole lot of room for making sense of where that virtue might fit in. What is the social practice that addresses those needs? And it's, for the most part, usually, I guess, considered to be the health industry. But that too tends to be dictated by a lot of kind of privatized thinking and self-interest. So it's not really a matter of compassion, it's more so a matter of profit, motives, and things of that sort. So is there a social practice in our society that addresses those needs and sees it as its purpose, first and foremost? And I'm not sure, so it's kind of strange to me. It makes me wonder if something has shifted in our thinking that has sort of corroded that as a social practice, because if you go back to a very primitive sort of tribal setup, where they're very teleologically minded and they're very much thinking about the purpose of each and every practice that they have. Clearly, their basic survival would be the first and foremost practice that they would concern themselves with and wouldn't let anyone fall to the wayside. Is it maybe because our society's too big and we have a tipping point, or is it just because we're engaged in a different kind of lifestyle that, yeah, is causing a lot of problems that we're talking about now, like environmental problems? So we need to be more socially minded and less individually minded.
So in the sense that the survival is coming from more of an instinctual situation and flourishing would be coming from more of a different level of consciousness where there's compassion and empathy, and that's where the struggle is?
I think the struggle is rooted a lot in the fact that we're not habituated to automatically think in any given situation what our moral role would be. So, like I said with this conference, most of us here are habituated in the virtues of patience and the virtues of that sort of thing. And if we found ourselves tending towards something like, chewing loudly or making a phone call, most of us would probably think, "Oh, I probably shouldn't be doing this," because we've sort of habituated a sense of virtue because we have built in a very intrinsic sense of what this practice is about. So from that standpoint, it makes me wonder, why can't we construct a society that thinks like that, and can habituate itself like that, and many more virtues other than something like patience? Most people think in today's world that the virtues of their life probably have a lot to do with maybe being punctual when it comes to work. Many people don't assume outside of the family, though, that compassion has much of a role, or at least not a role where they would feel as strange about someone in their community dying on the side of the road as they would feel strange about taking a phone call in this room right now. And so it makes me wonder what's going on here that makes prescriptive discourse, that is saying you ought to do this, you ought not to do that, so clear and objective, and what makes it so controversial, the guy dying on the side of the road to his neighbor or citizen of that community. And so that's what I'm kind of interested in philosophically with virtue theory, because I think flourishing and sustainability of something like this conference has a lot to do with our habituation and thinking about how we ought to behave in this situation.
So what would it take to be habituated collectively in anything like the way I was talking about?
Right.
What kinds of measures? It actually leads me to think about the here we are in the university, we're habituated, as you're saying, to the practices of classroom behavior or conference behavior and so on. But if you take the university as a whole, how well or how poorly is the modern university doing as a place for the kind of reflective deliberation that you're talking about, and other practices that lead to the kind of collaborative, forward-looking, enlightened policies that Arthur's talking about? What's Western got right or not? Is it not getting right? I put you on the spot. We're being taken out, so this will
well, I think the university traditionally is a great institution because it is one of the few places where you can have that conversation and it's not annoying. It's absolutely what we're supposed to be doing. But I think that kind of deliberation is probably much more vital than we think it is to a properly functioning community or nation state. And it's unfortunate that there's a lot of people who will never engage or enter that kind of practice because it's either way too expensive or it's just too exotic. So I think any community, it's really important when someone in that community, even if it's a very rural community or something, that someone in that community attempts to build up a civic practice that is a town hall or something where people get together and they question the purpose of what it is they're doing. Because you can very much get into the rut. You're living a very self-interested lifestyle of having no sense of purpose. And you will be in any given situation, and the only thing you would ever think that you ought to do is to keep anyone from interfering whatever the hell it is you want to do. And so I think that as like you were getting into it, Hawking and they were all very concerned about that because they thought morality itself and kind of scientifically determined understanding of morality came out of basically what principles allowed for a social system to sustain itself without turning into a kind of policy nightmare or against everyone against all. But
well, so one of the things I point out in my paper is that since capitalism ties personal wealth to survival, people generally, well, and since education, college education especially, requires money these days, people generally get like the minimum amount of education they need to get a job, which will then, promote their survival further. So there's not anything like Western could get right or wrong really on that, because it's socialism. And so, the space is there for discussion, but the material conditions don't allow for it in most circumstances.
That's a sense of the ivory tower, for better or for worse, right? I mean, because it's sometimes used derogatively to mean that we're kind of engaged in things that don't matter in the real world. But what I'm hearing you say is both of you, right? So this is one of the few places where you can have this kind of deliberation, but by necessity, it's not irrelevant exactly, but it's not, there's not an affinity between what we do here, perhaps, right, and the material conditions in which we actually live our lives outside the university. And I don't know how you solve that problem exactly. You could win another contest.
Next year's essay contest will provide the answers to that problem.
Here's a challenge.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I was just thinking about material conditions. Yeah, I think it's important. It's a difficult question because it's obviously like it flirts with very totalitarian ideas of someone who needs to get in charge of the economy and distribute everything just in the right ways, and that of course has its own impact on human flourishing. But I do think it is important to not fall into the trap of thinking that the moral question of any given situation is how much you stand to gain or lose in a kind of simple metric, like how much money do I stand to gain from this, or how much money do I stand to lose from this, like how much money am I going to lose if the university is trying to get more. The question should be more so, once again, kind of purpose-driven, in the sense that morality, I think, always has been a question of not what do I have, but more so what do I do with what I have, who do I do it with, and for what purpose. And once you kind of settle those questions, which tend to be questions of virtue and questions of, social initiative, from there you can start determining where the money are. And chances are things will allocate itself organically and for a good purpose. But aggregate of self-interested thinking will just continuously collide, and I don't think much will come to fruition.
Are there other questions? Well, at this point, I think we should thank and congratulate the winners of the first Ethics Center essay contest, Arthur and Mitchell, and thank you for your thoughtful responses and the wonderful papers, and I really, really appreciate it very much. Thank you.